In the heart of southern Mesopotamia, modern-day Iraq, two great rivers, the Tigris and Euphrates, carved a crescent of life into a harsh, dry land. Between them stretched a fertile plain, where silt-rich floods fed the earth but also threatened destruction. This land would become known as Sumer, the first civilization in human history. Here, around 5000 BCE, early communities began to form along the banks of the rivers. These people didn't merely survive, they adapted. They built irrigation canals to control the unpredictable waters, transforming flooding into food. The rivers brought not just danger, but the promise of abundance. As settlements grew, so did cooperation. Families became communities, and communities became culture. The rich black soil gave rise to farming, architecture, and the first steps toward organized society. In the silence of the plains, amid the sounds of flowing water and shifting reeds, humanity was preparing to write its first chapter in a land cradled by rivers and bound by vision. By 4500 BCE, in the warm flatlands of southern Mesopotamia, a quiet transformation was underway. The Ubaid people, often overlooked, but never insignificant, built the region's first known villages. No longer wandering, they settled beside rivers in homes made of sun-dried mud brick. These weren't simple camps. They were foundations of the world's first true communities. Their villages were organized, featuring central temples made not of grandeur, but of purpose. These communal structures, constructed from mud brick and reeds, were more than places of worship. They were centers of authority, ritual, and cooperation. Within them, early religious practices took form, guided by priests who may have also been the first civic leaders. The Ubaid dug irrigation canals with wooden tools, coaxing life from stubborn earth. They raised grain, herded animals, and crafted pottery with unique painted designs. Families worked, traded, and planned together. Bit by bit, a cultural identity was forming, one that would set the stage for something much greater. These early settlements became the soil in which the Sumerian civilization would root and flourish. As the early villages of the Ubaid era laid the groundwork for settled life, the Sumerians took the next step, mastering the rivers. The Tigris and Euphrates, once unpredictable and destructive, were now harnessed by complex systems of canals, levees, and reservoirs. Through careful engineering, the Sumerians transformed seasonal flooding into steady irrigation, making agriculture more reliable and expansive. Fields of barley, wheat, and date palms thrived across the fertile floodplain. This steady food supply supported growing populations and allowed people to specialize. Some became potters, builders, merchants, or priests. Trade networks extended beyond Sumer, exchanging crops and goods for raw materials like stone and metal. Their control of water wasn't just survival, it was civilization. The surplus it created enabled cities to grow, supported temples and writing, and made large-scale governance possible. In every canal and furrow, the seeds of urban life had been planted, and the world's first cities were ready to rise. With irrigation systems firmly in place and settlements thriving, the stage was set for the emergence of a new identity. By around 3500 BCE, a distinct people, the Sumerians, rose to prominence in southern Mesopotamia. Though their exact origins remain uncertain, their language stood apart from all others, a language isolate, unrelated to Semitic or Indo-European tongues. The Sumerians inherited the legacy of the Ubaid and pushed it forward. Temple design became more elaborate, with central complexes dominating their towns. Villages evolved into organized cities, laid out with intention and hierarchy. Their culture signaled a profound shift. Religious, political, and economic life became more structured. Urban civilization had begun, and with it came writing, administration, and monumental architecture. The land between the rivers was no longer just fertile ground, it was now home to history's first true cities, shaped by the hands and minds of the Sumerians. With the rise of the Sumerians came a true urban revolution. Around 3300 BCE, settlements like Eridu, Ur, and Uruk expanded into full-fledged cities, each home to thousands. At their heart stood towering temples, surrounded by bustling workshops, markets, and administrative quarters. These were not just population centers, they were engines of innovation. Craftsmen produced fine pottery, textiles, and metal goods, while merchants traded across Mesopotamia and beyond. Scribes kept detailed records of crops, goods, and labor. Urban life brought new systems: tax collection, organized labor, and land distribution. Public works, such as canals and roads, required coordination. Rulers and temple officials directed this complex society, making early cities both economic and political powerhouses. As people gathered under the authority of gods and kings, Sumer cities became the blueprint for future civilizations. What began as humble villages had grown into the world's first true urban societies. At the core of every great Sumerian city stood a massive temple complex, often built atop a stepped platform called a ziggurat. Each city pledged devotion to a patron god or goddess: Inanna in Uruk, Enlil in Nippur, or Nanna in Ur. The temple was both a sacred space and the beating heart of the city's economy. These temples owned vast lands, herds, and storehouses. Priests and temple officials managed resources, collected offerings, directed laborers, and organized distribution. Religious devotion was intertwined with practical governance. Festivals, sacrifices, and rituals brought people together, reinforcing loyalty and order. Statues of deities were bathed, clothed, and fed, treated as living beings. The temple symbolized stability, prosperity, and divine favor. Through worship and wealth, the Sumerians believed their gods maintained order. In honoring them, cities found both spiritual meaning and material power, binding faith to everyday survival. As Sumerian cities grew, so too did their need for leadership and order. Initially, priests held power, acting as mediators between people and gods. But over time, a new class emerged: priest kings, known as Ensi or Lugal, who led both in temple rituals and city defense. They wielded both spiritual and political authority. Sumerian society became increasingly stratified. At the top stood priests and rulers, followed by scribes, merchants, artisans, farmers, and at the bottom, slaves, often prisoners of war or debtors. Each class had specific duties in maintaining the city's survival and prosperity. Cooperation was essential. Vast irrigation systems, shared granaries, and defense walls required organized labor and leadership. These responsibilities strengthened local governments centered in temples and palaces. As roles became fixed, gender divisions also sharpened. Men dominated public life and leadership, while women's roles were often tied to the home or temple service. Social hierarchy and political structure became the foundation of Sumerian civilization. By the late 4th millennium BCE, Sumer had become the center of a growing web of trade. Caravans and boats connected it to regions far beyond. The Zagros Mountains to the east, the Persian Gulf to the south, and the Levant to the west. These routes brought exotic goods, copper, tin, timber, and luxury items into the Sumerian heartland. With expanding trade came new challenges. Managing warehouses, workers, and shipments required structured administration. Labor became more specialized. Some farmed, others crafted, traded, or kept records. As temple economies grew complex, the need to track goods, taxes, and labor laid the foundation for a revolutionary invention writing, which would fully emerge in the next era. This age marked the transition from simple village life to urban civilization. With organized religion, governance, trade, and early record-keeping, the Sumerians weren't just building cities, they were building civilization itself. By around 3000 BCE, the land of Sumer had transformed into a collection of independent city-states, each centered around a powerful urban hub, such as Uruk, Ur, Lagash, and Eridu. These were not provinces of a unified kingdom, but rival polities, each with its own government, laws, military, and patron deity. They shared language, traditions, and gods, but they ruled themselves. At the heart of each city rose a massive ziggurat, towering above homes, markets, and palaces. These stepped temples honored the gods believed to protect the city and empower its rulers. From these divine centers, spiritual authority and political control were deeply intertwined. Each city-state controlled its own canals, farmland, and trade routes, making them both prosperous and fiercely competitive. Disputes over irrigation access and territorial boundaries were common. Sometimes they were resolved through diplomacy, other times through war. Out of this tension and cooperation, the Sumerian city-state emerged as a new form of political life, independent, sacred, and organized. For the first time in history, urban society was defined not just by its buildings or people, but by its ability to govern, worship, and endure on its own. As city-states grew in wealth and complexity, the old priestly councils gave way to a new kind of leader, the priest-king, known in Sumerian as Ensi or Lugal. These rulers held both spiritual and political power, acting as the living representatives of the gods on earth. Their authority wasn't just law, it was sacred. The priest-king stood at the head of society. He led rituals in the temple, presided over legal matters, and commanded the city's military forces in times of war. When floods threatened or enemies approached, the people looked to their Lugal for protection, order, and divine favor. He also oversaw vast public works, organizing the construction of ziggurats, canals, walls, and roads. These projects unified the population, provided jobs, and increased food production through more advanced irrigation. To serve the gods was to serve the city, and in the Sumerian worldview, the king's power came from heaven. He was both a servant of the divine and a master of Mentha, first of a long line of sacred kingship that would shape Mesopotamian history for millennia to come. At the center of every Sumerian city stood a towering monument to faith and power, the ziggurat. These stepped pyramids rose above the skyline in layered tiers, each one a holy mountain built to bring humans closer to the gods. At the top stood a small shrine, the symbolic home of the city's patron deity, such as Anu, Enlil, or Inanna. But the temple was far more than a place of worship. It was the economic engine of the city. Temples owned vast farmlands, managed workshops, oversaw herds of livestock, and employed an army of laborers, brickmakers, weavers, scribes, and priests. In many ways, it functioned as both religious center and civic headquarters. Offerings of grain, oil, and livestock flowed in daily, filling temple storehouses and redistributing goods to the people. Priests tracked resources, settled disputes, and performed rituals that were believed to keep the cosmos in balance. In Sumer, the temple was not separate from daily life, it was daily life. It gave order, purpose, and prosperity to the city it watched over. To serve the temple was to serve the god's hand. To serve the gods was to serve civilization itself. Around 3200 BCE, a quiet revolution took place in Sumer's system of writing emerged. What began as simple marks to track grain and livestock soon evolved into cuneiform, the world's first full script, etched with reed styluses into soft clay tablets. Writing was born from necessity. Temple officials needed to account for goods, workers, and offerings. Tokens and pictographs became symbols, and symbols became words. In the storerooms and archives of temples, scribes recorded the life of the city, contracts, inventories, tax lists, and more. But cuneiform didn't stop at administration. Over time, it became a tool for law codes, myths, prayers, and poetry. It gave voice to kings and gods alike, preserving their words across generations. To become a scribe was to join an elite profession. In temple schools called edubas, young boys trained for years to master the stylus. These men became the record keepers, accountants, and storytellers of their world. With writing, Sumerians no longer relied solely on memory or speech. They created something new, a permanent record of thought, law, and culture. With cuneiform, they ensured that their civilization would speak long after their cities fell silent. Beneath the towering ziggurats and royal palaces, Sumerian life followed a clear and deeply rooted social hierarchy. At the top were the nobles and priests, believed to be closest to the gods. They held land, administered temples, and directed rituals that shaped public life. Beneath them stood the scribes, merchants, and artisans, skilled and educated workers, essential to the city's economy. Scribes recorded laws and transactions. Merchants moved goods across vast trade routes. Artisans built homes, forged tools, and sculpted statues of kings and gods. At the base of society were the farmers, laborers, and slaves. These men and women provided the food, labor, and service that kept temples and cities functioning. Their work was hard and unending, planting, harvesting, hauling, and building day after day. Most jobs were hereditary, passed from parent to child. Sons of potters became potters. Scribes trained their sons to write. In this way, society remained stable, even rigid. From the palace to the plow, from golden shrines to muddy canals, every Sumerian had a place. And though their roles differed, together, they upheld a civilization that would shape the world for centuries to come. As Sumerian cities flourished, they became economic powerhouses not just through farming, but through interconnected trade networks that stretched far beyond Mesopotamia. While canals were essential for irrigation, they also became the arteries of commerce, linking city-states and allowing goods to move swiftly across land and water. Sumerian merchants organized caravans and expeditions that reached distant lands. Dilmun in the Persian Gulf, Elam in the east, the Levant to the west, and even the Indus Valley far to the southeast. From these regions came valuable materials. Sumer lacked copper, lapis lazuli, timber, ivory, and rare gems. In exchange, Sumer exported textiles, grain, wool, and oil, all produced by a highly specialized economy. Scribes recorded inventories, merchants negotiated terms, and city officials managed tolls and trade laws. Canals and rivers became highways for wealth. This long-distance exchange brought more than material goods. It carried ideas, beliefs, and innovations, laying the groundwork for the cultural blending that would define later empires. Through trade, the Sumerians were no longer isolated. City dwellers, they became global players in the ancient world. Beneath the shared language and religion of Sumer lay a world of competition and conflict. City-states like Uruk, Kish, Lagash, and Umma rose and fell in cycles of rivalry and shifting alliances. While canals connected cities and trade, they also became the front lines of border disputes and war. Access to farmland, water, and trade routes often sparked battles between neighboring states. Kings led armies of spearmen and chariot warriors into open plains, seeking to capture territory or defend sacred boundaries. At times, alliances were forged through diplomacy. Temples acted as neutral ground where rival rulers exchanged gifts or signed temporary peace. But not all conflicts were forgotten. Victories and treaties were recorded in writing and carved into stone. Stelli upright monuments were erected to commemorate victories, honor fallen soldiers, or declare the divine favor of a city's god. These inscriptions served both as warnings and propaganda. Sumer's legacy of warfare was not chaos, it was the beginning of political history. Through war, peace, and negotiation, city-states learned to survive in a world where might, strategy, and the gods themselves shaped the fate of nations. As Sumerian cities matured, their cultural life deepened. Temples became centers not only of worship, but of creativity and reflection. Priests and artisans crafted statues, reliefs, and hymns, honoring gods like Inanna and Enlil with both beauty and devotion. This era saw the rise of monumental architecture, vast archives, and the earliest known law codes inscribed not just to track goods, but to shape society. Writing, once invented for accounting, had become a tool of civilization, used to record treaties, teach morality, and tell the stories of gods and kings. Through it, the Sumerians preserved their laws, values, and worldview for generations. Literature flourished. Myths, hymns, and heroic tales were composed and recited in temple schools and courts. These stories did more than entertain. They taught ethics, legitimized rule, and helped Sumerians understand their place in a divine cosmos. The cultural legacy of Sumer laid the foundations for future empires like Akkad. As the cities grew in size and power, so too did their ideas. In Sumer, history became memory, law became scripture, and culture became the bedrock of civilization itself. Around 3200 BCE, the Sumerians made a breakthrough that would transform civilization: the invention of writing. Using a sharpened reed called a stylus, they pressed wedge-shaped symbols into soft clay tablets, creating what we now call cuneiform. At first, writing served practical needs. Scribes tracked grain harvests, livestock totals, labor hours, and temple offerings. Tokens and pictographs evolved into standardized signs. As city life grew more complex, so did the writing system. Over time, cuneiform expanded to record contracts, legal codes, tax ledgers, rituals, royal decrees, and even stories. These tablets weren't just scribbled and discarded. Many were sun-dried or baked, stored in temple libraries, palace archives, or personal collections. Thousands survive today, fragile, yet immortal. Through cuneiform, Sumerians built a written memory, a way to preserve knowledge beyond a single generation. In clay, they captured the foundations of economics, governance, and belief. Their words etched in earth still speak across 5,000 years. What began as numbers and names became history, myth, and identity, all born from the press of a stylus on wet clay. In ancient Sumer, the ability to write was a rare and powerful skill. Scribes, the professional writers of the ancient world, were part of an elite class, trained from childhood in idubas, or scribal schools. There, they spent years mastering the complex system of cuneiform, which eventually grew to include hundreds of signs for sounds, words, and ideas. Training was intense and disciplined. Students copied tablet after tablet, memorizing symbols and perfecting the stylus stroke. Lessons included not only writing, but mathematics, accounting, and religious texts. Those who graduated became the record keepers of the gods and kings. Scribes filled the temples, courts, palaces, and markets. They managed inventories, tax ledgers, legal documents, contracts, hymns, rituals, and royal proclamations. Without scribes, there could be no administration, no law, no preserved history. To write was to give memory shape, to capture voice, law, myth, and authority in clay. In a world ruled by gods and kings, the scribe stood quietly between theme invisible but essential, holding civilization together with the tip of a reed stylus. Once reserved for counting and command, Sumerian writing grew into something richer, a vessel for poetry, prayer, and storytelling. Cuneiform gave shape to the deepest thoughts of the ancient world, hymns to gods, laments for cities, proverbs of wisdom, and heroic tales etched in clay. Among these works is the Epic of Gilgamesh, the world's oldest surviving heroic narrative. It follows a powerful king on a journey through grief, wilderness, and the search for immortality. Within its lines are echoes of friendship, loss, divine wrath, and human vulnerability. The Sumerians also wrote creation myths, explaining how the gods formed the heavens, the earth, and humanity's role between them. Other texts describe the afterlife, painting haunting visions of the shadowy underworld. These stories blended theological belief with cultural identity, passed down through temple schools and recitation. Through these texts, we glimpse a world that wrestled with purpose, fate, and the gods above. In the clay voices of Sumer, we find the earliest attempts to understand what it means to be human and to remember it. In the bustling cities of Sumer, numbers were not abstract, they were essential. To manage trade, farming, construction, and worship, the Sumerians developed one of history's most influential tools: mathematics. Their system was based on 60, not 10. Known as sexagesimal, this base 60 math gave us lasting concepts like 60 seconds in a minute, 60 minutes in an hour, and 360 degrees in a circle. These weren't just useful, they were elegant, divisible, and practical for calculating time, land, and astronomical cycles. Scribes created multiplication tables, practiced division, and developed early geometry to measure fields and build canals. They calculated areas, volumes, and angles with surprising precision. In temple schools, students copied rows of math problems, just as they practiced writing words. This mathematical system would endure long after Sumer itself disappeared, adopted by Babylonian astronomers, influencing Greek geometry and ultimately shaping modern science. From clay tablets and styluses came the numbers that structured space and time. The Sumerians didn't just count, they measured the universe, one line, one angle, 160 at a time. For the Sumerians, the night sky was more than mystery. It was a clock, a calendar, and a message from the gods. From temple rooftops and ziggurat towers, priests and scribes watched the stars, charting their movement to guide both earthly tasks and divine rituals. They tracked the phases of the moon, creating a lunar calendar with 12 months based on the new moon's cycle. This calendar regulated agriculture, signaling when to plant and harvest, and it aligned with a rhythm of religious festivals, offerings, and ceremonies. Over time, they observed planetary paths, constellations, and eclipses, noting their patterns in clay. These were not just scientific observations, they were signs of divine will. Celestial cycles were tied to deities and destiny, shaping political and spiritual decisions. By linking sky to earth, the Sumerians brought order to the chaos of time. Their astronomical records laid the groundwork for Babylonian star charts, Greek cosmology, and modern calendars. In watching the heavens, they sought not only knowledge but meaning. Their skies were filled with gods, and their nights with numbers. In Sumer, time itself was sacred. While Sumerians charted stars and recorded myths, they also applied knowledge to daily survival. In fields and clinics, their wisdom shaped two of the most vital sciences: agriculture and medicine. To feed growing cities, they refined irrigation planning, using levees, canals, and gates to direct water efficiently. They developed crop rotation to preserve soil fertility and improve the plow, increasing food production. Farming was no longer guesswork, it was systematized, studied, and inscribed in clay. Equally advanced was their approach to healing. Sumerian tablets describe over 200 medicinal recipes, blending herbs, minerals, and ritual incantations. Diagnoses were based on symptoms, dreams, and omens. Healers part priest, part herbalist recorded treatments for wounds, fevers, and even mental illness. These writings formed the roots of early pharmacology, diagnosis, and holistic care. While their medicine was spiritual as much as physical, it represented a key step in humanity's understanding of the body. For the Sumerians, to write was to preserve life in field or temple, on battlefield or sickbed. Their science was not just for the gods, it was for the people. As cities grew and society became more complex, Sumerians turned to writing not just to count goods but to define justice. Law was no longer passed by. Word of mouth it was pressed into clay. Some of the world's earliest legal codes appeared in Sumer, centuries before Hammurabi. One of the most famous is the Code of Ur-Nammu, written around 2100 BCE. It laid out laws covering contracts, marriage, inheritance, property rights, and punishments. These codes helped resolve disputes, protect citizens, and uphold royal authority. Legal decisions were recorded by scribes in temple courts. These texts show not only rules, but moral principles about fairness, responsibility, and civic duty. Punishments were often proportional: a fine for a stolen sheep, restitution for a damaged field. The goal was to restore balance, not simply to punish. Law in Sumer was seen as sacred, granted by the gods and enforced by kings. Tablets of judgment were stored in archives, consulted for future rulings. Through these early laws, the Sumerians laid the groundwork for legal ethics, procedural justice, and the belief that society must be governed by written order, not personal power. In Sumer, knowledge was sacred and it had a home. From the heart of each city, adubas, or scribal schools, trained the next generation of thinkers. Here, young boys spent years copying texts, memorizing signs, and studying law, math, and literature. These were the first structured schools in history, where education became a system, not a privilege. As knowledge expanded, it needed to be stored. Within temples and palaces, the Sumerians created the world's first libraries, archives filled with thousands of clay tablets. Stored in reed baskets or stacked on shelves, these collections preserved contracts, hymns, myths, legal codes, astronomical data, and more. These libraries were more than storerooms, they were symbols of authority. Only the literate elite could access them, and through them, control time, memory, and administration. Knowledge became a tool of both governance and religion, a bridge between gods and men, between the past and the future. Even as cities rose and fell, these tablets endured. The words they held etched in clay and sealed in silence carried the voice of a civilization. In Sumer, the written word was not just preserved, it was protected. In the flat, fertile plains of Sumer, peace was rare. The city-states of Uruk, Lagash, Umma, and Ur shared language and gods, but they competed fiercely for power. Their rivalries were not driven by empire, but by water, land, and trade, the lifeblood of survival in ancient Mesopotamia. Each city-state controlled its own canals and farmlands, and disputes over boundaries often sparked open conflict. Skirmishes evolved into wars, and walls rose high around cities to keep enemies out. Temples became arsenals. Leaders became generals. This was an age of shifting borders and fragile alliances. Armies marched across the plains, fighting over irrigation channels and sacred lands. Out of necessity, cities developed standing armies and fortified defenses. The ruler was no longer just a priest-king, he was a warlord, chosen for strength and strategy as much as for divine favor. These wars were often remembered in inscriptions and stelae, turning battlefield victories into lasting political statements. Even the gods were invoked to justify conquest. Through this struggle for dominance, Sumerians laid the foundations for the idea of city, state, and military power. In their conflicts, the world's first vision of empire began to take shape. As warfare became central to survival, Sumerian kings transformed. No longer just priestly figures, they now stood as warrior leaders ruling with sword and stylus alike. These kings were charged not only with protecting their cities, but with expanding their power through conquest. One of the most legendary was Gilgamesh of Uruk, a king so renowned that his deeds passed into myth. Said to be two-thirds divine, he was remembered as a temple builder, wall raiser, and warrior, whose epic journey reel or Reimagined echoed across the ages. His name became a symbol of strength and legacy. Another powerful figure was Enlil of Lagash, a historical king who led his army to victory against the rival city of Umma. His triumph was immortalized in one of the world's first war monuments, the Stele of the Vultures. Carved in stone, it depicts soldiers marching in formation, enemies trampled beneath divine favor. These kings ruled not just by decree, but by divine right and battlefield success. Their victories were offerings to the gods and messages to their enemies. They forged a new model of kingship where leadership was earned in temples and proved in war. In the chaos of constant wars, one man rose to unify the fractured lands of Sumer, Sargon of Akkad. Around 2334 BCE, this Semitic-speaking leader from northern Mesopotamia launched a campaign that would change history. He conquered the powerful city-states of Sumer and forged the world's first true empire. Unlike the priest kings before him, Sargon ruled not a single city but a realm that stretched from the Persian Gulf to the Mediterranean. He built a standing army, highly trained and loyal, that marched across the region, toppling rivals and securing trade routes. His victories were swift and strategic, but conquest was only the beginning. To hold this vast domain, Sargon appointed governors to rule provinces in his name and enforced Akkadian's native language in administration and record-keeping. He blended Semitic traditions with Sumerian culture, uniting diverse peoples under one banner. For over 50 years, Sargon reigned as emperor, reshaping the political map of the ancient world. He was no longer just a king, he was king of the four quarters of the earth. In Sargon's rule, the age of empire was born. When Sargon conquered Sumer, he didn't destroy its culture, he absorbed it. The Akkadian Empire became a powerful blend of two worlds: the old Sumerian traditions and the Semitic customs of the north. The Akkadians adopted the Sumerian Cuneiform script, using it to write in their own Semitic language. They preserved Sumerian religion, worshipping gods like Enlil, Inanna, and Nanna, and continued the rituals, hymns, and festivals that had shaped Sumerian identity for centuries. Art and architecture also reflected this fusion. Temples, ziggurats, and palaces remained Sumerian in form, but with new symbols, styles, and language inscriptions. Even legal practices followed Sumerian models, as Akkadian kings issued decrees in familiar formats. This cultural synthesis allowed Sumerian knowledge to spread across the growing empire. Through Akkadian rule, Sumer's science, literature, and beliefs reached new peoples and regions. Rather than vanish, Sumerian identity evolved, its legacy woven into the fabric of empire. In conquest, Sargon didn't silence Sumer, he made it imperial. The voice of Sumer now spoke through two languages, two peoples, and one empire. Conquest gave Sargon an empire, but it was innovation that held it together. Ruling over distant cities and diverse peoples, he needed more than soldiers. He built the world's first imperial bureaucracy, centralizing power in Akkad and appointing governors, called Ensi, to rule provinces in his name. These governors collected taxes, managed local law, and reported back to the capital. Scribes documented everything from harvest yields to temple donations, building a network of record-keeping that stretched across the empire. Sargon also strengthened control through religion. He appointed his daughter, Enlil, as high priestess of Inanna in Ur. She wasn't just a political tool, she was a poet, a thinker, and the first known author in recorded history. Her hymns to Inanna blended theology and empire, shaping both spiritual life and royal authority. Trade expanded as well. Caravans and ships moved between Mesopotamia, Anatolia, and the Indus Valley, carrying tin, lapis lazuli, wool, and grain. These routes brought not just goods but ideas and influence. Sargon didn't just conquer, he administered, traded, and inspired. His empire was not just held by the sword, but by the pen, the poem, and the ledger. No empire lasts forever, not even Sargon's. Despite its innovations, the Akkadian Empire could not escape the forces of rebellion, overreach, and invasion. Tensions simmered beneath the surface. The southern Sumerian cities, proud of their traditions and autonomy, often resisted imperial control. Revolts erupted in cities like Ur and Umma, forcing Akkadian rulers to wage constant campaigns to hold the empire together. After Sargon's death, his successors struggled to maintain power. Administrative strain, economic imbalance, and prolonged conflict weakened the empire from within. Then came the Gutiansa mountain people from the northeast. Around 2150 BCE, they descended into Mesopotamia, exploiting the chaos and devastating urban centers. The empire collapsed. Central authority vanished, governors disappeared, and long-distance trade routes fell silent. Temples were looted, canals neglected, and cities like Uruk and Akkad plunged into darkness. Sumer entered a dark chapter, a time of chaos, loss, and fragmentation. The memory of empire lingered in broken tablets and abandoned walls, but for nearly a century, order had no home. Yet even in collapse, the story wasn't over. Sumer's identity endured, waiting to rise again from the dust. From the ashes of empire and invasion, Sumer rose again. Around 2112 BCE, the city of Ur reclaimed its place as a center of power. Under Ur-Nammu, founder of the third dynasty of Ur, Sumer entered a new golden age, what historians call the Sumerian Renaissance. Ur-Nammu restored order, rebuilt cities, and launched massive temple-building projects, reviving sacred traditions abandoned during the Gutian chaos. But his legacy extended beyond stone. He issued the Code of Ur-Nammu, the oldest known law code written in a structured legal form predating Hammurabi by centuries. The code emphasized fairness, listing penalties for theft, violence, and corruption, proof of Sumer's advanced legal thinking and moral ideals. It was justice not by whim, but by written law. Ur-Nammu's son, Shulgi, continued the dynasty's rise. He strengthened administration, reformed education, and promoted the arts. Sumerian literature, science, and religion flourished once more. This rebirth proved that Sumer's identity could endure conquest, chaos, and collapse. The Ur-3 dynasty reclaimed not just land but memory, law, and greatness. It was a second beginning, the last brilliant flame before the twilight. The cities of Sumer would eventually fall. By the early 2nd millennium BCE, foreign powers, Amorites, Babylonians, Elamites took control of the land once ruled by priest kings and emperors. But Sumer's story did not end in silence. Its language, though no longer spoken, remained the sacred tongue of priests and scholars, used in temple hymns, legal texts, and royal inscriptions for centuries. Sumerian scribes continued to train in ancient grammar, mythology, and rituals, ensuring the knowledge endured. The concept of divine kingship, born in the ziggurats of Uruk and Lagash, became the model for rulers across Mesopotamia. Temples remained at the heart of cities. The practice of writing, once invented to track grain, became a symbol of power, law, and memory across empires. Babylonians and Assyrians adopted Sumerian deities, myths, calendars, and literary forms. The Epic of Gilgamesh was copied long after Sumer had vanished. Its voice, etched in clay, still echoed in new dialects and distant ages. Though its cities crumbled and its name faded, Sumer lived on in scrolls and rituals, in law and language. Its legacy became the foundation of Mesopotamian civilization. After years of chaos and foreign rule, Sumerian civilization rose once more. Around 2112 BCE, the city of Ur emerged as the new heart of Mesopotamia. Its king, Ur-Nammu, founded what would become known as the Third Dynasty of Ur, or Ur-III, beginning of the Neo-Sumerian Renaissance. This revival followed the collapse of the Akkadian Empire and the withdrawal of the Gutians, whose disruptive rule left Sumer fragmented and weakened. But the Sumerians had not disappeared. In cities like Ur, Uruk, and Lagash, local leaders preserved traditions and waited for their chance to rebuild. Under Ur-Nammu's leadership, Sumer was reunited not through brute conquest but through order, faith, and reform. The capital city of Ur became a vibrant center of politics, religion, and culture. It was a return to the roots of Sumerian identity, but with lessons learned from empire. Temples were restored, laws were codified, and scribes once again filled archives with hymns, records, and decrees. This was not a repetition of the past, it was a refinement. The Sumerians had returned, and for a brief moment, they stood brilliant once more. As he rebuilt temples and restored order, Ur-Nammu offered more than walls and statuettes, gave his people law. Around 2100 BCE, he issued one of the earliest legal codes ever recorded, written in clear Sumerian script centuries before Hammurabi. The Code of Ur-Nammu laid out a vision of structured justice. Penalties for theft, false accusations, injury, and corruption. Regulations on marriage, inheritance, and property rights. Unlike later eye for an eye systems, many punishments were fines, showing a preference for restitution over revenge. More than a list of rules, the code declared why justice mattered. Ur-Nammu portrayed himself not just as a ruler, but as a divinely appointed lawgiver chosen by the gods to bring order, protect the weak, and maintain peace. His laws were sacred, inscribed on tablets and monuments, and enforced across his kingdom. In creating this code, Ur-Nammu established a new image of kingship, just, orderly, and God-blessed. Future rulers, from Babylon to Assyria, would follow his example. And in these laws, the Sumerians revealed their deep commitment to fairness, balance, and human dignity. During the reigns of Ur-Nammu and his son Shulgi, Sumer entered a golden age of architecture, engineering, and art. Across the land, temples and palaces rose from the dust, crafted not just for function but for beauty, symbolism, and the gods. At the heart of this transformation stood the Ziggurat of Uruk, massive step temple dedicated to Inanna, the moon god. Built with baked brick and advanced planning, it towered over the city, symbolizing the bridge between heaven and earth. Its layers, stairways, and shrine reflected a vision of cosmic order, stone shaped into sacred geometry. Beyond ziggurats, the Neo-Sumerians rebuilt administrative centers, storehouses, and shrines, uniting design with civic function. Walls were inscribed with dedications. Drains and courtyards revealed engineering skill and city planning. Art also flourished. Stone reliefs, cylinder seals, and statues showed refined detail and religious devotion. Kings were depicted with divine favor, surrounded by symbols of powerlians, stars, gods. Scribes carved hymns and praise poems into their work, blending beauty with meaning. This was more than decoration. It was a cultural statement. Sumer had returned not just in strength, but in splendor. While Ur-Nammu laid the foundations, it was his son Shulgi who perfected the Neo-Sumerian state. Ruling for nearly 50 years, Shulgi was more than a king. He was a scholar, priest, administrator, and reformer. His reign transformed Sumer into a model of efficiency, unity, and divine kingship. Shulgi standardized weights and measures, ensuring fairness in trade and taxation. He reformed the scribal schools, raising the standard of education and preserving Sumerian literature, law, and science. His administrative records are some of the most detailed in Mesopotamian history. To unify his realm, Shulgi expanded the bureaucracy, appointing regional governors loyal to Ur and constructing roads and communication networks. He didn't just control territory, he linked it, city by city, ledger by ledger. But Shulgi also reshaped royal identity. He declared himself divine, blurring the line between king and god. Hymns praised him as wise, radiant, and eternal, a ruler of both earth and spirit. Under Shulgi, order replaced chaos, and the spirit of Sumer was codified not only in brick and law but in ritual, symbol, and soul. He ruled not just with power, but with precision and purpose. Beneath the ziggurats and royal statues, the true strength of the Ur-3 dynasty lay in its bureaucracy. Under kings like Shulgi, Sumer became a civilization of paperwork and clay. Across the empire, scribes documented everything: temple offerings, land grants, tax collections, harvest yields, labor quotas, and diplomatic gifts. These records weren't occasional, they were systematic. Every temple, palace, and city center became an archive, filled with tens of thousands of tablets. Government agents managed complex systems of taxation and redistribution, moving grain, textiles, livestock, and silver across the kingdom. Trade routes were regulated. Contracts were written and sealed. Inventories were checked and cross-checked. Even distant governors sent regular reports back to Ur. This wasn't just administration, it was information control, the world's first fully integrated civil record system. Today, many of these tablets survive, offering modern scholars an unmatched glimpse into ancient Sumerian life. They reveal a world where law, economy, and ritual were recorded in extraordinary detail. This was the high point of Sumerian statecraft, a society managed not only by kings and gods, but by scribes with styluses and archives of memory. In the Neo-Sumerian world, the temple was everything, not just a house of the gods, but the beating heart of the city. Under the kings of Ur-3, temples were rebuilt, expanded, and revitalized like never before. Massive ziggurats, including the Grand Temple of Inanna in Ur, rose high above the plains. These stepped towers were more than symbols, they were cosmic ladders, linking heaven and earth, gods and people. Their construction brought thousands together in labor and celebration. But temples were not only sacred spaces, they were economic engines. They managed storehouses of grain, operated as banks, and ran scribal schools. Priests and priestesses oversaw both ritual and redistribution, blending spiritual and administrative authority. Religious life flourished. Hymns were composed and copied, preserving the voices of earlier ages. Myths were retold, sometimes reinterpreted to reflect the ideals of Neo-Sumerian kingship and divine favor. Public festivals returned, with music, offerings, and processions filling temple courtyards. The gods were once again central, present in clay, in song, and in stone. This temple revival wasn't just about religion, it was about restoring the soul of Sumer, reaffirming that even after war and collapse, the divine order could be rebuilt. The Neo-Sumerian Renaissance lasted just over a century, but its impact reached far beyond. Though the Ur-3 dynasty eventually faded, the systems it built shaped Mesopotamian civilization for centuries to come. In Ur's palaces and temples, the Sumerians perfected the tools of governance, bureaucratic hierarchies, standardized taxation, record-keeping, and regional oversight. These innovations didn't vanish, they were adopted and expanded by the Babylonians, who modeled much of their empire on Ur-3's design. The Sumerian language, though no longer spoken by all, endured as the language of law, ritual, and scholarship. In scribe schools, students continued to study its grammar, copy its texts, and preserve its myths. Temple libraries housed thousands of tablets, ensuring that Sumerian knowledge would not be lost. Art, too, retained its signature form, stylized figures, divine symbols, and architectural motifs passed from Ur to Babylon, from clay to memory. Sumer's influence lived on not through armies, but through archives, temples, and schools. It endured because it was written, remembered, and revered. Even after the Neo-Sumerian era ended, the voice of Sumer continued to echo in the hands of scribes and in the structure of empires yet to come. By 2004 BCE, the golden light of the Neo-Sumerian Renaissance began to dim. From the east, a new threat emerged: the Elamites, fierce warriors from the highlands of Iran. They swept across Sumer's weakened cities, and in a single devastating blow, they sacked the city of Ur and brought the Ur-3 dynasty to an end. The fall was more than a military defeat, it was a final political eclipse for the Sumerians. With the collapse of Ur, there would be no more Sumerian kings. The centers of power shifted northward, to rising cities like Babylon, where new rulers adopted and adapted the traditions of Sumer. The Sumerian language, once the voice of gods and kings, slowly faded from daily speech. The people who had invented writing, ziggurats, and the first codes of law disappeared as a distinct group. And yet, Sumer did not vanish. Its ideas lived on. Its myths, tablets, temples, and systems shaped the empires that followed. The Babylonians called themselves heirs to Sumer. The Assyrians built ziggurats of their own, and scholars for generations studied the language of Ur. Though the last Sumerian city had fallen, its memory had not. Sumer became not just a civilization, but a foundation. The fall of the third dynasty of Ur marked the beginning of the end. After nearly 2 millennia of innovation, power, and legacy, the world's first great civilization began to unravel. Around 2004 BCE, the Elamites sacked Ur, toppling the last major Sumerian dynasty. In the aftermath, the region splintered. City-states that once stood proud, Uruk, Lagash, Nippur, struggled to maintain independence, falling one by one to rising outsiders, most notably the Amorites. But war was not the only threat. The land itself began to betray its people. Over-irrigation led to soil salinization, crippling agricultural output. Once fertile fields turned white and barren. The Tigris and Euphrates shifted, isolating cities that once thrived on their banks. Sumer's power, once forged in canals, kingship, and cuneiform, faded into fragments. By 1900 BCE, the Sumerians were no longer rulers but memories within their own temples and libraries. Yet even in decline, something remained. In the silence that followed the last Sumerian kings, their legacy whispered still in clay, in myth, and in stone. As the old Sumerian cities weakened, a new force emerged, the Amorite Semitic, speaking people from the west. They didn't arrive in a single invasion, but gradually, city by city, they became rulers, merchants, governors, and eventually kings. By the early 2nd millennium BCE, the Amorites controlled much of southern Mesopotamia, including the once great cities of Ur, Uruk, and Nippur. They didn't destroy Sumerian culture. Instead, they absorbed it. Temples were maintained. Scribes continued their work. The Sumerian language still echoed in ritual and law. At the heart of this new order rose a small Amorite city, Babylon. By the time of King Hammurabi, around 1792 BCE, Babylon had become the dominant power in Mesopotamia. Hammurabi's law codion, of the most famous in history, borrowed heavily from earlier Sumerian legal traditions, including the Code of Ur-Nammu. Sumer as a political entity had vanished, but its architecture, administration, and theology remained deeply embedded in the Amorite Babylonian world. The conquerors ruled the land, but they walked in the footsteps of Sumer. By around 1700 BCE, the Sumerian language, once the living tongue of kings, farmers, and scribes, vanished from daily speech. In homes and markets, people now spoke Akkadian, the Semitic language of the Amorites and Babylonians. But Sumerian did not disappear. Instead, it entered a new phase, sacred and scholarly. Like Latin in medieval Europe, Sumerian became the language of ritual, law, and learning. It was no longer spoken, but it was studied, recited, and revered. In temple schools called edubas, young scribes learned Sumerian grammar, vocabulary, and poetry. They copied ancient myths, hymns, and royal decrees. These exercises weren't just academic, they preserved the voice of a lost civilization. Religious ceremonies still used Sumerian prayers. Legal texts retained Sumerian phrases. Even kings invoked Sumerian gods in their Akkadian inscriptions. The language of the past had become a symbol of continuity, wisdom, and divine order. Though no longer alive in conversation, Sumerian lived in the mind and hand of every educated Babylonian scribe. In this afterlife, the language endured for more than 1,000 years, not spoken, but eternal. Even as cities fell and languages faded, the Sumerians found immortality in clay. Across the ruins of ancient Mesopotamia, archaeologists have uncovered tens of thousands of cuneiform tablets, many dating back more than 4,000 years. These fragile pieces of fired or sun-dried clay have outlasted kings, dynasties, and even the civilizations that wrote them. Among them are laws, like the Code of Ur-Nammu, hymns and prayers to gods long silent, mathematical tables and medical recipes, contracts and royal decrees, and most enduring of Alepic literature. The most famous of these is the Epic of Gilgamesh, heroic tale of kingship, friendship, loss, and the search for immortality. First composed in Sumerian, it was reinterpreted, translated, and preserved for centuries by Akkadian, Babylonian, and Assyrian scribes. These texts were not buried, they were copied by hand, line by line, generation after generation, in scribal schools and temple libraries. Through them, the thoughts, dreams, and fears of the Sumerians continued to speak. In clay, the mind of Sumer endured not only as record, but as story, soul, and legacy. Though the Sumerians were gone as a people, their civilization lived on, fully absorbed into the great powers that followed. The Babylonians and later the Assyrians did not reject the past, they built on it. In Babylonian temples, priests still chanted Sumerian hymns. Gods like Enlil, Inanna, Nana, and Utu remained central to the Mesopotamian pantheon. The very idea of divine kingship, a ruler chosen by the gods to bring order, was a Sumerian invention that Babylonian and Assyrian kings continued to claim. Temple economies, where sacred institutions controlled land, labor, and storage, mirrored Ur's ancient system. Codified law, refined by Hammurabi, had its roots in Sumerian legal codes like that of Ur-Nammu. Even the structure of time and science followed Sumerian precedent. The sexagesimal system base 60, math gave us 60 minutes in an hour, 360 degrees in a circle. Their methods of astronomy and calendar making were preserved, elaborated, and transmitted. To be Babylonian or Assyrian was to speak through the voice of Sumerto, worship their gods, count with their numbers, and rule with their ideals. The first civilization had not ended. It had simply become the standard. Though long forgotten by name, the Sumerians echo through Western civilization and law, religion, literature, and myth. Centuries after their cities fell, their stories lived on. The most striking is the flood narrative. In Sumerian texts like the Tale of Ziusudra, and later the Epic of Gilgamesh, a great flood wipes out humanity only for a chosen survivor to build a boat and preserve life. This story predates and parallels the biblical flood in Genesis, suggesting a shared regional memory passed across cultures. The Sumerians also imagined a complex cosmos, heaven above, the netherworld below, and divine forces shaping fate. These ideas would influence later Mesopotamian religions, and eventually ripple into the theological frameworks of the Hebrews, Persians, and Greeks. Their innovations were not only spiritual. The Sumerians gave the world the first written law, the first planned urban grid, and the first belief in a king whose authority was sacred and legal. Even in the West, when we speak of law, order, justice, cities, and divine narrative, we may still be echoing a civilization that lived, wrote, and imagined long before the Bible. In clay, the Sumerians created not just records but roots. For thousands of years, the Sumerians were silent. Their cities lay buried beneath the sands of southern Iraq. Their language was unreadable, their name forgotten. And then, in the 19th century, the world began to listen again. Archaeologists digging in the deserts of Mesopotamia uncovered the remains of Ur, Uruk, Lagash, and other long-lost cities. Beneath crumbling ziggurats and temple walls, they found tens of thousands of clay tablets, preserved in archives hidden beneath the earth. At first, no one could read them. But through decades of work, scholars began to decipher cuneiform. The first voices to emerge were not kings or warriors but scribes, recording crops, hymns, laws, and prayers. Slowly, piece by piece, the world's first civilization reappeared. We learned their names, their gods, their cities, and their stories. We heard Gilgamesh speak. We read Ur-Nammu's laws. We watched Inanna descend into the underworld. In dusty libraries and remote sites, Sumer had spoken again, not in conquest, but in memory and discovery. A civilization buried for millennia had returned not as empire, but as echo. They no longer walk the earth. Their cities are ruins. Their language is silent. And yet, the Sumerians never truly vanished. They gave the world writing the power to preserve memory beyond the moment. They created cities, the model for how humans live together. They crafted the first legal codes, scientific observations, poetry, and philosophy of kingship. Their gods shaped mythologies that would echo into Babylon, Assyria, Canaan, and even Greece. Their systems of time minutes, hours, degrees still structure our days. Their voices, recorded in clay, continue to speak in libraries and museums around the world. Sumer may have fallen before Egypt reached its peak, long before Rome, before Jerusalem, before Athens. But what they built was not bound by stone. It was civilization itself. We may never know what they called themselves, but we remember what they gave us. They are whispers in the dossiers, but they are also the first voice of history. And that voice still echoes every time we read, rule, build, or remember.